that gives food for thought on the importance of innovation, not to discount those countries that, between brackets, only have frugal innovation or disruptive innovation, because Israel went from that to where it is today. Iran has showed that it's got a bite to it, and Taiwan has shown that you don't need to have a moonshot innovation strategy, but you can be focused on one and be wholly committed to be able to become a very important player.
Welcome to Hunter's War. My name is Hunter, and this is a podcast about the intersection of geopolitics, war, and society. Today's conversation is with Edoardo Giglio, currently a partner in risk advisory and the defense, security, and justice industry leader for Deloitte in Italy. He once worked for the New Scotland Yard as a high-tech investigator, and his work in risk advisory has taken him across Africa and the Middle East, consulting with governments and multinationals. He has extensive academic credentials, including currently being a doctoral candidate at the University of Reading, researching the influence of innovation ecosystems on geopolitics. That has led to him writing the book, which we will discuss today, Tech Tides: How Innovation Shapes Global Power. In the conversation, we go beyond traditional hard power to explore a world where the battlefield is seen as shifting from tanks to tech stacks. Edoardo and I dive into the innovation that created the Silicon Shield of Taiwan, the frugal innovation that has allowed nations like Ukraine to punch above their weight, and the unfortunate reality of why Europe is currently being left behind in the global innovation race. We also tackle the curse of resources in nations like Nigeria and discuss why, even in an era of generative AI, the human factor remains the ultimate architect of our reality. This conversation with Edoardo and his book reinforced for me that innovation isn't just a tool for progress, it is the foundation of global power. As always, shoot me an email if you have any questions or comments, hunter@hunterswar.com. Let's get to the conversation. Edoardo, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
You have what I would call an unconventional background. You worked at the New Scotland Yard as an investigator, undercover operations. You have experience in conflict zones in Iraq and in Libya. You have experience consulting with large corporations around cybersecurity, innovation strategy. And what is exciting for the rest of us is you took a lot of that experience and you combine that with some really extensive case studies around countries and their innovation ecosystems, and you put that together in a book. The first thing that kind of popped up for me as I was reading the book, and you start with a little bit, is we are in a moment of European capitals focusing on hard power. They're thinking about military buildup. They're thinking about more tanks, about armored vehicles, about missile systems. The premise in a lot of what I was reading in the book is the battlefield has transitioned from that hard power toward innovation and innovation ecosystems as really being the future of how to think about geopolitical tensions or conflict. How do you balance the shifts that we're seeing with what you were reading and understanding that drove you to write this book, this kind of tanks versus bytes balance?
Sure. So I think the epitome for all of this premise really is the now infamous NATO exercise, which was recently conducted, where the Ukraine managed with their drone warfare units to essentially neutralize two what we would class as conventional NATO battalions, one of which was from the UK. That doesn't necessarily mean that all hard power is over, but it does indicate a shift in warfare. Drones themselves, and we're not talking about the Reaper drones or the Predator drones that have become so perfusive in our thoughts from movies and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but we're talking about the dual-use technologies, or COTS, commercial off-the-shelf, which are drones like DJI drones, which we may use to take photos of our backyard when we're enjoying time with our families. That's what we're talking about. They've been repurposed and with less manpower have been able to neutralize hundreds of millions worth of Cold War assets, and essentially just shown that strategy has evolved. And now in warfare, strategy has always evolved. One of the aspects that many would say is that technology has always been at the forefront of warfare. That's very true. It's been the case from ancient Chinese time, from the start of the gunpowder, to the Romans, to the fall of Constantinople with the mega cannon. But the difference is that they were vertical stovepipe technologies which were implemented within your standard strategy. What we're seeing now is the utilization of technology to really alter the balance of power. And that's really something in the book you'll probably see in the Israeli chapter, especially when we talk about the frugal innovation and then disruptive innovation journey, which Israel went upon. And that's why there's a premise of bytes are more important than bullets, and certainly it's the case now if you look at the technology stack as well. So what's become obvious at the moment on the battlefield is what gives you the edge on the modern battlefield is what's defined as a multi-domain operations. That is being able to coordinate different assets from different countries on different technology stacks to give you the maximum visibility, and therefore being able to target more precisely with less wastage and more efficiently. That gives you an incredible advantage because it means you can store less ammunition, you can expend less resources on hard assets like tanks. They cost 20, 30, 50 million per asset. You can destroy one with a $200 drone. And all of this has to operate on the cloud. And who does the cloud infrastructure belong to? Now, perhaps moving into a little bit more of the standard geopolitical speak. Well, it's not Europe, unfortunately, or the rest of the world. It's mainly the US with your Amazon cloud services, your Google cloud services, all of the Oracle cloud services, all of the main participants. And then, of course, China's moving with the Alibaba cloud and other companies. So the infrastructure belongs to them. If the infrastructure belongs to you, anything that's below that is subordinate to it. And that's one of the friction points which we see nowadays with the European defense is finding itself because, one, we don't have the hard power that the United States have because we've depended on the United States for certainly the last 80 years under the US global policing strategy. Now, of course, they've reverted, it seems, to a Monroe or Dunroe doctrine. Yep. And secondly, we haven't invested in technology. We've been left behind. And one of the reasons I argue we've been left behind is because we don't have the innovation ecosystem. We don't have an innovation strategy to be able to participate. And that's one of the reasons why Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley. I'll go into very detailed explanation to why it's so unique. Even in the United States itself, they couldn't replicate it on the opposite coast, which is quite interesting. And not having that and having quite a confused set of directives, policies, a European Union, which is not a federation. You still have national sovereignty, which may take over or take prevalence over the European Union itself. If we look at investments, there's no clear form of investments. There are many, but the bureaucracy is all different. It's difficult, basically. So that's the whole premise that the whole book is based upon.
Well, and I want to get into kind of pieces of the book, but you touched on two strategies that both help us get there, but also hopefully can enlighten on some of the certain geopolitical challenges of Europe because they are large. Your book analyzes or helps us understand these innovation ecosystems, the different categories of innovation, and what those outcomes could be in terms of power. Tell me more about those ecosystems and those categories of power, but also, if you could, speak more to what you're saying about the challenges that Europe is needing to address in terms of deciding in the direction it's going.
Absolutely. So two premises. One, it's a result of research conducted for clients worldwide that were seeking to set up innovation ecosystems. So I've had the privilege of being able to speak and interview a number of organizations, innovation organizations like DARPA, for instance, but not only, Toyota Research Labs, so corporate and governmental innovation ecosystems. So I've been able over the course of 5 years to have a very detailed and privileged insight into all the building blocks. And secondly, it's also a result of the research I conducted at the University of Reading precisely on what makes an innovation ecosystem and how Europe could set one up. So with that in mind, perhaps if we take a step back and just analyze one of the very few prescriptive elements which Mario Draghi famously wrote in his 400 and odd page Draghi report, which sent shockwaves for its very clear and quite undiplomatic message. The majority of that 400-page document was very descriptive. It described the problems of Europe. It described the problems of not having a single direction, described a problem with demographic. We're an old society. problems with aligning national strategies with European strategy. But out of all of those 400 pages, it's very curious that the one prescription that he provided was that of creating a European DARPA. And that's very interesting because he basically hit on the key elements which can ignite a change in how Europe and the West, outside the US, is able to project its power, for the lack of a better word, on the national stage. Because at the moment we're largely irrelevant from that perspective, if we are brutally honest. And if we then look at who is the most successful innovation country and innovation ecosystem on the planet, well, it has to be Silicon Valley. And there's a very, very clear reason why that is. One, it's the peculiarity of a whole set of variables which came together. So post-Second World War, DARPA, before becoming DARPA, was called ARPA. There was the chief scientist called Vannevar Bush, who famously wrote many letters to Roosevelt back in the day, worried about the German innovation, how quickly the Germans were innovating. So the seed of understanding that innovation was fundamental went all the way back, even before the end of the Second World War. As soon as Second World War finished, a set of elements came together. You had the presence of Stanford Research Institute, Stanford University, together with what would become the new DARPA, together with fantastic weather, all of these elements which people take for granted, favorable taxation, great place to grow your family. These are very important elements because looking at other places around the world, and without naming any countries or any particular client, there have been instances, and people will no doubt have seen them on the papers, of certain countries even dedicating hundreds of billions of dollars to innovate, and they were never able to do so. And that's because they look at it in a very, very narrow perspective. That's one point. Don't take into account on all these other variables, because if you speak to an engineer from Google, one of the reasons that they don't want to leave San Francisco area, traditionally, looking at during the Cold War period, it had to do with a whole set of circumstances. They're happy for the family to live there. He's at, or she is at, immediate and proximity to universities, greatest university in the world, to industries that are able to create spin-offs, support from the government. So DARPA is not the only one, but it's one of the key drivers. And so that's one aspect that renders it absolutely unique. And in fact, the US tried to replicate the Silicon Valley model on the Boston route on the East Coast, where if one were to just look at it just on paper, it would make complete sense. Of course, you're going to be able to recreate it because you've got Harvard, you have, you've got proximity also of the political establishment. One would think it's fantastic, it's perfect, and it failed. It failed because it didn't have all of the variables that the Silicon Valley geography had. It's almost borrowing the concept of prisoners of geographies by Frank Copian. There is an element of that, which is often neglected. The second one is they had a very, very clear vision of what they wanted to do. So we tend to use, in not just Europe, but everywhere around the world, you hear politicians, but even businessmen, scientists themselves, many of them, they describe research and development with innovation, and innovation is research and development, as if they were completely interchangeable. They're not. And it's not just a taxonomy issue. It's not being picky or finicky about precise meaning of words, because research and development is a tool within an innovation strategy. And if you don't even know what the tool is and what strategy belongs to, you can't plan ahead. And for many innovation strategies, you're looking at a 1, 3, 5, 15 or moonshot 15 plus year potential. That's the second aspect. So that Silicon Valley has very clear what Israel had and has very clear what Europe is lacking. Here is where, if I may even be a bit critical of even Draghi himself when he talked about the creation of DARPA. My suggestion is that it was probably the wrong thing to say, because the creation of a DARPA is not in itself gonna create the lightning in the jar or create the innovation. There's a whole set of aspects. The first thing we need to understand is what type of innovation strategy are we going to undertake? So the state, DARPA, for instance, is very moonshot. That means, and in fact, DARPA's motto is, if it's not impossible, it's not a DARPA problem. That mission statement encapsulates moonshot innovation. And maybe here I'll take 2 seconds without going down into the weeds too much on just outlining a framework for
Yeah.
innovation strategy. There are many. There are many. The one I propose, and it's simply because it looks at it from a macro perspective, is borrowed from the Harvard Business Strategy framework. And it looks at four main categories of strategy. So you have your basic innovation, which is basically your academic papers, your leadership, your thought leadership, your eminence, you're basically on the drawing board. You're starting to think of ideas. So these would be universities, typically your PhDs. They have great ideas, great thesis, and then we need to test them. You have your sustainable innovation, which has nothing to do with ecology, sustainability, but it's to do with incremental innovation over the course of each year on an existing technology. So I have an iPhone and I want the battery to last longer. Okay, so I focus my energy on sustaining that particular innovation over time with incremental changes, which are easily measured and are probably easily achievable. You're not going to probably be able to gain a massive strategic advantage of it, but it's dependable and it's there. Then you have your disruptive innovation, which is more of a 5-year horizon where you have an existing technology. Let's take the iPhone just to keep the same analogy. And instead of ameliorating or improving an existing technology within it over time, you are literally thinking of bolting on another capability completely, which could be 5 years time. I want my iPhone to have holographic capabilities. So when we do like a Teams call on my mobile phone, I can see projected as a hologram. Now that already exists, so you're not doing anything massive. It's disruptive because at the moment, to get that technology within an iPhone, within the same limit, make sure that it aligns with all the other parameters, battery life, et cetera, it's going to take some work. But again, it's disruptive because it doesn't exist at the moment. The last one of which is your moonshot innovation, which what everyone typically thinks of, which is your 15-year plus. And that could be anything from a new type of satellite, SpaceX's reusable rockets. That could be argued that it's not really moonshot because it kind of already existed, but the capability itself is pretty out there, and it took over a decade to achieve. And that requires a whole set of different types of investment. And then within each one of these strategical buckets, you have your tools. So in research and development, typically sits within your sustaining innovation or disruptive innovation. That's within Harvard Business Model. I then bolt on another one, which is called frugal innovation, right? And frugal innovation is aligned to dual use technologies and commercial off the shelf. It means that you don't have necessarily the resources, or you may have the resources, but you decide that for that particular context, your strategy is going to involve utilizing what you have at the moment and repurposing in a completely novel way. And the Ukrainian conflict has shown us this, but before the Ukrainian conflict, the masters in this, and again, I'm not providing any positive or negatives on any sort of political, but I'm just looking at it literally empirically from a strategic innovation aspect, is Israel, because they started with a newly formed state with very, very limited resources. Sure, now you have Israeli lobbies and there's lots of money flowing, etc. But many people forget that at the very beginning, certainly up until the 70s, they were struggling to get even the most of modest of donations. So the only way they could proceed with building their state is to innovate through what they had available. And they have become the undisputed masters of dual use technologies. And in fact, the drone, what will become known as the Predator program, etc., that the CIA then took on the end of the 70s, that started with the Israelis who went over to the US. They would send people from the IDF around the world to business fairs and things of this nature to look at what was readily available they could purchase at a low price and then repurpose. And they went to a toy store. They went to a toy store in the United States. They found the very first remote controlled planes. And they thought, great, we don't have the money to have jets to conduct surveillance on our borders. Maybe we can use this somehow. And that's how it all started. For a whole set of different peculiarities, they then evolved from that into the the powerhouse certainly of a very narrow set of innovation, which is cyber and digital. The Bathsheba Business Park, for instance, or all of a number of the softwares, some of them obviously becoming infamous, that they have created is a result of that. And again, because there's 7 million of them at any one time in Israel, they've had to kind of merge the civilian and military into one. And the peculiarity of how they've been able to then go from frugal to disruptive to moonshot innovation is also a product of being constantly surrounded. Civilian and military is fused. That means that you serve in the military, you then go out in civilian life, you remain on the reserve force. You have full support from the military. If you have any innovative ideas, you get supported, not just to create it, but also to set up a business, create business relationships, etc. And that kind of feeds its system, not replicatable in most countries, I would imagine. And so that's what allowed them to do that. But what each of these and innovation ecosystems, so the really successful ones, Silicon Valley and Israel, just to pick two, have shown, they have clear, is they have a very clear taxonomy. They've got a clear language of what innovation is. They've got a clear understanding of what innovation strategy means, the different types of innovation strategies, and in a clear vision of which one, based on their peculiarity of geography, resources, budgets, political will, they are going to follow. And going to your second part of your question, this is the main problem. This is the crux, not just from my perspective, but voiced in the Draghi report as well, and many, many, many others of Europe. In Europe, we have 150 plus innovation valleys. Many people don't even know what an innovation valley is. You have an European Innovation Index, which measures innovation in different geographies, but doesn't take into consideration whether it's biotech innovation, which Netherlands and Germany are very, very good at, or defense innovation, where, for instance, Italy, with some of the well-known defense companies, without naming them, are good at, and many, many others, and no understanding of why it is that within those countries that particular innovation is so successful, and no idea of which one are we going to pursue. We seem to have a buckshot approach. We're going to innovate everything all at the same time. We're going to do sustaining, disruptive, moonshot all at once without a clear vision and with a whole complex set of directives. We've got the AI Act, the EU Space Act, all of this tsunami of directives and regulatory aspects, some of which are obviously very useful and, there to protect, and the spirit is to protect the sovereignty and the of Europe and the states within Europe, the 27 member states, but also the individuals. But at the same time, it's applied over a framework which is amorphous as well, because we haven't decided as Europe on which innovation strategy to pursue, and you can't choose all of them with the same weighting. And that's maybe just a third concept that I make clear in the book, which is you need to approach innovation much like a venture capitalist would. A venture capitalist has a bubble graph, typically a bubble graph investment plan. You have different quadrants and you have different risk levels on where you're going to be investing. Startups, you've got seed A, B, seed, 5-year, sales strategies, etc. They don't concentrate all at once. You can't apply everything at the same time because you're not going to ignite the innovation engine, as I call it. And then the last ingredient for a successful innovation ecosystem is measurement. Typically, we look at innovation as inputs and outputs. I want to see how much I put in, and I want to capture the lightning in the jar output otherwise on the other side. And if I get that output lightning in the jar, then it's successful. And if it's not, then I leave it. It's a very reductive and, if I may, superficial way to look at it, because you're never going to be able to understand what actually is working or not if you just look at the input and output. One of the metrics that only the successful innovation ecosystems look at, Silicon Valley being one of them, many corporate innovation labs as well are very good at that, is your process metric. That means keeping a clear eye on the actual journey of the innovation that you have decided.
Okay.
So moonshot innovation, we decide we're going to undertake moonshot innovation strategy in our geography X, our brand new nation state, for a whole series of reasons. Fantastic. We decide the amount of money we want to put in, and we have an idea of what we want to have at the end in 15 years. In 15 years, we want our moonshot to enable us to take full advantage of the space economy within the lunar ecosystem. Right, fantastic. Well, we can't just wait 15 years and see if we're going to be successful or not. We can't, because even if we do achieve it, we won't be able to know exactly what variables played to allow us to reach that. And that's where process metrics enter the fray.
Maybe quickly to touch on the decisions around the strategy, and then I want to get into a few different use cases. But does it require strong political direction to set this strategy? How did you see in these different ecosystems that initial strategy? Because there is always kind of, like you're saying, the tactical that has to be done along the way and the understanding of the environment. But that direction setting at the top seems fundamental to this succeeding. How in the different case studies, how does that strategy decision making happen? And is it a political decision? Is it a corporate decision? Is it a military decision?
Absolutely. Political decision is and we're talking about for a nation state, is the single most important element which needs to happen in order for it to have a successful outcome, regardless of what innovation strategy you're going to undertake. The most obvious example of this is the United States with Project Paperclip. I mentioned right at the very beginning the Vannevar Bush and Theodore Roosevelt letters, fascinating sets of exchanges on the worries of how quickly Germany had become a scientific powerhouse, and also a worry on post Second World War, how they were going to manage the Soviet Union from taking over or becoming in itself highly competent at scientific innovation. And it's quite amazing if one thinks on one of those letters, one of the ideas that they were discussing was of regulating within Europe how quickly or who should be allowed to innovate within the geographies, which is quite ironic, seeing where we are today with the current geopolitical climate of the US being obviously very against the EU's regulation on AI and things of that nature. Once upon a time, they were the ones that wanted to promote the regulation in order to keep the lid on the innovation ecosystem. So they had a very, very clear political mandate, political will, which started from the executive office, of course, the president, but it permeated throughout the two houses as well, Pentagon, of course, and that wouldn't have been otherwise, because the so-called triple helix, or now quadruple helix, which is academia, government, NGOs, and private industries, they can only operate in complete symbiosis and an equilibrium if you have a strong political will. So that needs to happen from the top. You need a clear decision. And Operation Paperclip was one of the very, very first outcomes of that, which then allowed the US to gain a predominance over in the space race, USSR space race. One of the most fundamental examples of innovation importance in geopolitics, and I studied that in depth in my research. And that was the same also with other countries. And if you look at what's missing in Europe, it's precisely that. Why? A number of reasons, but one of the main ones is there is no clear voice. Everything in the European Union has to be done with complete consent and assent from all member states, because we have a president, but the president is truly a first amongst equals, not in the prime ministerial sense, but truly a first amongst equals that can't take any decisions until all 27 member states agree. And that's one of the criticisms. Innovation aside, where is the EU going to go with this new world order that's been created, where the world order based on rules has been essentially torn apart? You need a strong decision taken and then an execution plan to do that. You can't keep deliberating and wasting cycles of talks. It serves well when you're in a rule-based order and when you have great stability because it's the epitome in many ways, from a philosophical standpoint, at least, of democracy, but it doesn't really serve the purpose, and certainly doesn't serve the purpose on innovation. And it's the same also if you look at private organizations. It's the will from the top, from the CEO, from the board, that initially mandates, sets the vision. I know I'm accused many times of using some consultant speak, but I do come from the consulting world as well. But it is absolutely vital. The vision is vital. Otherwise, you're not going to know where to go. And that will needs to be set, not in stone, but you need to be, it can't be recalibrated every 1 or 2 years. Like, you need to see it through. You need to have a plan and see it through for a decent amount of time based on the innovation strategy you want to undertake.
Well, let's then talk about the innovation strategy of Taiwan, because I think that to leave
Yeah.
Europe a little bit, I think a very interesting and unique one, and especially the concept of Silicon Shield, which you reference, is one that I would say is a almost positive weaponizing of the ecosystem for their own protection. Tell me about how you understood the development of that strategy.
So Taiwan, very, very unique. Another one, unique innovation ecosystems, because it was born out of a initially private enterprise. So the CEO of TSMC, the world's top semiconductor producer, that almost 90% of the world is dependent on their product, which is why also China wants to take control over it. It was started from a Taiwanese immigrant who worked at Texas Instruments in the US, looking at the calculators and then the very first semiconductors, and then decided to immigrate back to his country of origin and set up what would become TSMC. Now, initially, that was a private enterprise and was purely entrepreneurial spirit that initiated that. From the research, I don't think there was any idea of how critical it would have become. It was innovative because, from the perspective of, I would say initially, more of a sustaining innovation, because you had an asset semiconductor which it was accelerating simply because of the number of people that were starting to then have desktops, etc., in the homes, and then the absolute acceleration of mobile phones, and then the increased digitization only made it more important. So it was kind of like a snowball effect. And then also to remember that at the time, we were still firmly believing that Moore's law, which predicted what the limits of semiconductors would be based on how many elements within a semiconductor you could create, and we didn't have the nanotechnology that is there today. You're still operating with that in mind. So you couldn't even think of a Taiwan like it is today back when TSMC was created. But the government, Taiwanese government, quickly was able, talking about political will, and to your point before, was able to capitalize on that, saw it, recognized it, and then put the full force of investment and to then assist TSMC to become the behemoth that it is today. And we've seen the US trying to promote semiconductor construction in the US with Intel not going very well. Again, a whole host of circumstances, a cost of workforce, scalability. TSCM now has decades worth of experience on production lines, efficiencies, now robotics, that to be able to set one up now and try and recoup, it's difficult. I wouldn't say impossible. Nothing's impossible, but it's very, very difficult, and risk reward probably is not there. So this means that Taiwan has essentially positioned itself as one, if not the key player within the current geopolitical landscape, because if we all agree that multi-domain operations and innovation and technology, which has then been accelerated post-COVID with everything being digitized and many aspects of our lives which weren't digitized before, if we all agree on that premise with some minor, perhaps points of contention, but if that's the core premise, all of these aspects, that infrastructure can only exist with semiconductors. And let's not forget, when we had COVID and there was the issue with supply chain, we had many issues with cars. People would wait 3 or 4 years to get a car because a typical car has 20 microchips in it nowadays. I mean, it's complex,
Yeah.
and there were just not enough microchips. So that all creates a situation where Taiwan's importance increases, and it becomes a crown jewel for whoever has influence over. And that also links with one of the latest spats that we've seen, the Chagos Islands.
Yep.
Why has it become such a big issue, Chagos Islands? Well, because it's one of it's the only base that the West has that can project power towards the Taiwan Straits. And that's why China wants it, because China has influence over Mauritius, which
Yep.
apparently now is going to have the prelation and the responsibility of essentially taking Chagos over, and all the tensions that we have on the Taiwan Straits, and that's why China desperately seeks it. Everything runs on those chips. So that innovation was accidental initially, but accidental only in how it's become now. An example of a visionary that had an understanding of how precious that element would be, a foresight of how important a semiconductor would be, thinking of how many people would be utilizing chips and microchips, etc., and then bolted onto that the government with a clear political will that seized the moment, seized the day, put the full force of the government behind it, understood the importance of innovation, and then a fluke of circumstances, cheap labor force, the syndicates and workers unions, lax compared to European standards, lax compared to US standards. That's another one of the issues of repatriating all of the production that we typically send abroad. That's why we've done it. And in Europe now, we only have one. We got ASML based in Netherlands. That's the and that is a lithography production plant. And if you recall, earlier last year there was then kind of friction of them wanting to potentially move the headquarters from Netherlands over to the States, and then the EU intervened, classing it as a critical infrastructure. That in itself politically tells you everything you need to know about how vital that is. And it's absolutely key.
Yep. And I think the Taiwan example for me is a real reinforcement of really your subtitle of the book about how innovation shapes global power, especially today in Europe. We're thinking about military might. What the Taiwan situation, accidental or not, in terms of how it was created, has shown how these ecosystems can really reshape or change geopolitical situations. And if we, not to just do the counterfactual, but if we think about the way the U.S. would look at Taiwan strategically, if it didn't have the ability to produce those chips, it would be a different conversation. If we, in Israel is similar. If it's been able to create, from a technology perspective, something that has had an impact globally and kept itself strong in surviving as a state, that evolved from the innovation ecosystem. So really thinking about how that collection of decisions coming from a political will combined with factors of geography and other things can really lead to the geopolitical situation we have today. So that Taiwan one for me hit home. I would love if you could speak to a couple more examples, and then we'll get into a few other areas. You cover some that had, let's say, more negative outcomes. You talk about Iran and kind of being out of the system, but the Nigeria and the Ethiopia ones were also eye-opening to me, because it is also how you make a decision on which path you're going to follow and what it leads to. So can you tell me more about Ethiopia's innovation strategy?
Yeah. So that's in the part where I talk about the cost of being outside the innovation ecosystem, and there are a few examples. So Ethiopia, sure everyone recalls historically the drastic, awful and dramatic famine which they were subjected to in the 80s, and Live Aid, etc. And the amount of funding which they were provided, not just from the UN, but a whole host of philanthropic organizations, which were at the forefront of agricultural innovation, for instance, and desperately trying to resolve the famine issue. That's one of the basics. If we look at Maslow's pyramid, even before thinking of creating an innovation ecosystem, you need to have the basics, right? Food, shelter, water. The major thing in Ethiopia has historically been, because of droughts and everything, has been food. So what some philanthropic organization looked at was, well, let's ignite the agricultural innovation aspect. So let's send over are most qualified experts on, for instance, next generation seeds that could resist droughts and could become very productive within the specific environment and the earth that's in Ethiopia. And unfortunately, it hasn't been as successful as all of those innovation efforts and funds could have been or were thought they would be. The initial thought, and this is again going back to the aspect of innovations are incredibly complex, and it's not just because you provide someone with an innovation strategy or an innovation asset that they're going to be able to bring it forward, because there's a whole host of other variables at play. Amongst them was, for instance, that didn't work so well in Ethiopia was, for instance, the aspect of capacity building. You got these great new seeds, new equipment. You have latest technology for accelerated growth, for increasing production, increasing yield, but then your local universities are weak. There aren't many. The ones there are weak. And so you don't churn out the amount of agricultural experts required to sustain that innovation that you were provided. There is aspects such as government intervention, the regulation, the taxation aspects. I mean, all of these aspects were, I wouldn't say ignored, because one also needs to understand that when organizations go in, they are just organizations and you can't do everything at once, as we discussed before. They didn't fully appreciate the complexity of doing that, and that's why the funding is just it's a continuous, never ending funding cycle. The second you stop funding them, it stagnates and there is no innovation. And that's one of the sad truths about Ethiopia. The same with Nigeria. Nigeria is hit is also a victim of the curse of resources, right? So the curse of oil specifically. They used to have, I mean, people forget, they used to have incredible avocado plantations, some of the best avocados in the world, which now is called green gold, were from Nigeria. Banana plantations. Back in the 70s, before the oil industry really started to pick up, doing incredible exporters. Now they import it. They import the very things for which they were known for. And if you go to during season and look around at the avocado, I wouldn't even call them farms, they're all derelict, the majority of them. They're lying on the ground. I mean, it's incredible. You do a quick calculation on how much they could make just in avocados alone. I wouldn't say it would solve everything, but it's part of the puzzle. And instead, you have the situation where it's all oil based. All the expertise on the agricultural aspect has now been lost because it's been decades and decades. Corruption levels to the hilt. There is no innovation at all because the innovation is brought in by the oil and gas companies. Rampant corruption on all parts of the government. And again, this is factual. I mean, I've spent many, many years in Nigeria as well. From IMF to World Bank, you take your pick of the investigations that have been done. That's the sad truth of it. Another sad and dramatic example, because they've got one of the fastest growing young populations in Africa, incredible potential, incredible technical and technological savvy. If you look at the amounts of doctors and engineers that emigrate from Nigeria and come to the West, it's phenomenal. It really is phenomenal. Just from statistics, I don't have them before me, but I urge the listeners to go and look at that. I mean, it's quite something. So they have almost a European problem of the brain drain, because EU has exactly the same brain drain issue. Incredible revenue still from oil, much less than what it was before, when the price of oil was 100 barrels plus. Destroyed agriculture, where they're all importing and it's costing them to import, and almost a political will to remain outside the innovation ecosystem, because at the end of the day, you've got the curse of the oil. It pumps up from the ground. You take a percentage from the concessions that the oil and gas companies come in and produce, and that's it. And that's the current situation. Different from Iran. If you want, I can touch base on Iran, because you touched upon it quite rightly. Iran, victim for other reasons, without going into the Shah 70s. and how it came about, the political regime to come about. But if we just park it for a second, they willfully decided to be outside of the innovation ecosystem to a lesser extent than North Korea, because they truly have completely secluded themselves with very obvious results. But Iran has decided to shut itself off for ideological reasons. And nonetheless, they're able to produce with sustainable innovation, frugal innovation, and some disruptive innovation, some aspects of technology, which, okay, they might seem at first sight pretty primitive compared to what a US military establishment can certainly provide. However, you look at Ukrainian context, okay, Ukraine, we provide a lot of kits, a lot of technology, of course, and I'm not for one second diminishing that, but let's go back to the very first premise of our talk today. That NATO exercise, that wasn't the technology provided to them that allowed them to defeat 2 battalions of NATO state members. It was readily available, off the shelf drones, together with an incredible amount of accrued war experience, frontline experience that enabled them to do that. So if you then look at Iran, that's why it's always been a concern, quite aside from the fact that they also have the nuclear capability and, well, they're trying to develop new nuclear capability. I talk in the book about Natanz and the centrifuges and how they've used, that was an example of frugal innovation, because the rods and the centrifuges, they came from a completely different industry. That's how they managed to import that in and evade the embargoes. And then they had issues with the velocity of the actual centrifuge itself, which Stuxnet managed to exploit. But that's an incredible example. They managed to do that with lesser technology, with much less evolved technical know-how, and still slowly, of course, compared to our technologies, but still able to build up enough of nuclear material that we decided to unleash, or the West decided to unleash Stuxnet. Again, that gives food for thought on the importance of innovation, and also not to discount those countries that, between brackets, only have frugal innovation or disruptive innovation, because Israel went from that to where it is today.
Yep.
Iran has showed that it's got a bite to it, and Taiwan has shown that you don't need to have a moonshot or singing or dancing innovation strategy, but you can be focused on one and be wholly committed to be able to become a very important player. Now, they've got defense issues because they couldn't defend themselves, but nonetheless, they're a crown jewel, I would say.
I want to be respectful of your time here. I think we're coming to the end, but there's one elephant in the room that I'm not asking about, and I'm curious how you feel it factors into this, and that's AI. And I think specifically thinking about large language models, generative artificial intelligence, what role has the recent innovations in the way that AI is being leveraged by both companies and militaries played into your current thinking? Because your book came out, I believe, end of last year. So you're probably writing as all of these things are happening. So tell me where AI factors into this and how you're thinking about it today.
So it's provided a shortcut on a great many tools within innovation strategy buckets. So if you look at, for instance, basic research, what would once upon a time take you a team or team of teams of PhD students from all over the world to create ideas now, and although many AI models aren't great at providing great new ideas, if you have the right person and with the right background, the right prompts, and the right inspiration, it can extrapolate a whole host of branch ideas from your initial thought immediately, which once upon a time would have taken you months or years to produce. That then gets replicated in all other aspects, such as, for instance, the controlling your metrics, your process, input and output metrics. Now you can create an agentic or agent AI to monitor it, give it the right parameters, almost on a daily basis. You don't even have to do it quarterly. So that's incredibly powerful. On the opposite side, you have, it depends where you're deploying it, because there are countries such as US and China. We don't actually know the full extent of how evolved their AI is, because it's perimetered. And also the state has given no guidelines on privacy or things of that nature for political reasons. That means it's free to roam, and free to provide innovation ideas, especially in the defense sector, which are highly worrying from a, say, EU perspective. We have the AI Act, which is quite prohibitive for European AI companies. That's why at the moment, EU has lost the race on the AI. That's the true aspects, because the data sources, and the data stacks that you need for your learning models, you kind of like in a straitjacket of what you can or can't use. And I know that the AI Act has got different layers of risk levels and some exemptions, but nonetheless, it is a bit prohibitive. And that's why the US has been kicking back on the EU for especially AI used by the cloud services and by the tech giants for the same reason, because it's limiting um, the amount of free play that you can have, which if China didn't exist, it wouldn't be as much of an issue, but you've got someone that is free to progress and not. The other aspect that wasn't so much on my radar when I was writing the book was the current problem of energy usage. So if you didn't have the energy usage and water cooling aspect as an issue, which now looks like it's becoming increasingly, then that has a whole set of parameters. Now with that in play, you have all of a sudden aspects of, okay, well, there's going to be limitations, not on the technology itself and the innovation you can create from it, but on how much infrastructure we can actually build before that goes, with all the other issues at hand. So environment, again, EU's gone for better or for worse. I'm not, on one side or the other at all on this, but it's just empirically speaking, has got some very stringent environmental laws. And that means that data usage and the amount of CO2 that you produce, you've got limitations of it, for the protection of the environment, and it's noble. And of course, I'm not saying otherwise. From a defense perspective, purely defense or geopolitical perspective, it's an issue because China certainly is not going to play by those rules. They're going to pump out CO2 like they've done since now. And that's the counter argument that the US has with leaving the Paris and the Tokyo Accords, and the friction with the Trump administration on that front, which again plays on the geopolitical aspect, and it plays on how innovative you can be. So highly complex issues, really complex web of variables.
Yeah. I want to close off on one last question. I think we could keep going for a while here, but the human factor is the title of your last chapter. This is a book and a conversation really around how to create technologies, how to put out things that will change the world around us. It tends to be physical, both in a software physical sense of what you're creating, but you end on the human. Tell me about what the human factor is and why you felt in a book about innovation ecosystems, you needed to come back to this element of the people involved.
Sure, because at the end of the day, the human element is the driving force and of any innovation. That's where it starts from. That's where the light of inspiration originates, and it latches on to your two comments during the course of this conversation. One of which was political will, and one of which was was the importance of, the capacity building aspect. But it originates from there. And even if you were to have, let's say, AI's, well, until we have the AI singularity, whenever that will be, some people say tomorrow, some people say never, etc. At the end of the day, it's still driven. Decision on which course to undertake is a human element. How you deploy all of these technologies, how you decide to utilize the innovation ecosystem is a human element. And uh, uh, that's been clear from, all the examples. Look at what Iran's chosen to do, North Korea's chosen to do, Nigeria's chosen to do. Why is it they ended up like that, and the Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley, or many EU countries are ahead of innovation, and you have constant want of people to join those ecosystems, because it's a human decision element that drives it, and it's the humans that make a decision on it. The AI can't make a decision on its up until now on its own, and either which way. One interesting paper I was reading the other week was pertaining to the probable, and it was like a neuroscientist, a renowned neuroscientist, the probable inability of any artificial system to be able to generate novel ideas seemingly from nothing like humans do because of a whole set of complex architectural, neurological and anatomical structures that we have within our brains. So important to understand the architecture of innovation, important to understand that there are modules that you can plug and play that are necessary, important to understand there are metrics you need to measure. Perhaps those things an AI could replicate or assist, but deciding where you're going to go, why you want to go there, and which decisions you take to employ them, that is all human based. And that's why it's still central that we can't delegate, we can't abdicate that. That's still us.
Edoardo, this has been a fascinating conversation. I appreciate you taking the time. I will definitely recommend that everybody read the book. I'll put a copy of that, link to it in the show notes. Is there anywhere that people can find you if they're interested in kind of learning more about what you're writing and thinking?
Yeah, sure. So I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So my LinkedIn profile, you'll see a whole host of articles, and then I have a Substack as well that you'll see on my LinkedIn. And and then you'll probably see updates on my forthcoming book, which is more human oriented, which is Architects of Reality, and it's all about mindset in the age of algorithmic ecosystems. So you'll see updates on that.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.